at lexical development in autistic children. And so what we know is that while the onset is like when they start developing their lexical knowledge, while that may be delayed, in general, there are lots of similarities in their lexical development to that of typically developing children. So, for example, if we look at the lexical diversity, the number of different words, the variety of words, is fairly similar, right, once the lexicon starts to develop. And they also have a noun bias in their early vocabularies, where if you just look at the proportion of nouns, say, rather than verbs, or just nouns overall in the lexicon, autistic children have the same noun bias that we see in typically developing children. A recent study from 2019 found that actually there's some sensitivity in autistic children to social cues, like following a speaker's focus of attention, like where they're looking or where they're pointing, in order to learn the labels of novel objects, which is something that typically developing children do. And a study from 2018 also found that autistic children have a similar ability to typically developing children to learning what a word refers to just by tracking its use across multiple situations. This is something known as cross-situational learning. It's something that we think typically developing children do a lot. So, all of these different things seem to be in common between the lexical development of autistic children and the lexical development of typically developing children. But there are some notable differences. So, for example, mental state terms, things that talk about cognition, like think and know and imagine, and words that refer to emotions, right, are underrepresented in autistic children, right? Although it turns out that girls who are autistic tend to use more of these than boys who are autistic, but they're still, in general, underrepresented, right? That's a difference in type of word that's in the lexicon. Relatedly, autistic children have difficulty labeling emotions, right, that they observe in like little video snippets or vignettes, right? Just sort of recognizing the referent, right, of an emotion is difficult for them. And low verbal autistic children, autistic spectrum disorder, ASD children, turns out that they tend to produce more general all-purpose verbs, right, than typically developing children, and even the high verbal ASD children do, right? So these are verbs like make or do or go that you actually see in very, very early development of typically developing kids. When they're first trying to figure out their lexicon, they use a lot of these all-purpose ones in combination, like go bye-bye, go night-night, go car, right? They do it, go ride. They do it in combination with other terms, right? They use a lot of these, and this is something that apparently low verbal autistic children never really stop doing. They just generally keep using more of these all-purpose verbs that are sort of not very specific in terms of what they're picking out. And, why might this be? And so Nichols and Tech in 2017 in their summary article suggest that all of these effects, these differences, can be traced to difficulties in socially based meaning discernment. That is, figuring out what things mean using social cues. Now, again, autistic children, certainly high verbal ones, they can use some kinds of social cues, but they're not as good at it, right? So in general, children who find it difficult to read the mental states and emotions of others will understandably find it difficult to learn the words that refer to these mental states and emotions. And of course, this is even more difficult for lower functioning children, right? And so these lower functioning children who experience even greater difficulties in navigating the cognitive and social world out there basically over-rely on those all-purpose words that are essentially bleached of specific lexical content, right? And if we look now at sort of the organization of the lexicons that they do have, there are also notable differences, right? So autistic children, interestingly enough, don't seem to have a shape bias when learning how to extend the meaning of new words, unlike typically developing children and adults. So if we call this first thing up there a DAX, right, this guy right here, we are very likely to also call these things DAXs, right? Adults, typically developing children, but not autistic children. They don't think that things that have the same shape are more likely to have the same label, right? And categorical induction seems to be impaired. So categorical induction allows the extension of properties that are associated with one instance to another instance. It's generalization, really. So if you learn that all three of these things are called DAXs, and you're like, oh, look, this one likes to roll on its back. That's a property. If for typically developing children and adults, you would then assume that because all three of these things are the same category, that property of liking to roll on its back gets shared, right? These things, you also would therefore infer that these things also like to roll on their back. But autistic children don't seem to be able to generalize that way. They don't seem to be able to induce the transfer of properties from one member of a category to another, right? That seems to be impaired.